Welcome to this economic policy webinar. My name is Kevin Mumford, and I'm the Kozic Director of PURCE, the Purdue University Research Center in Economics. The center's mission is the sharing of empirical economic policy research. So essentially, our researchers analyze data to better understand how laws, regulations, and government programs affect our lives. And then we communicate our research findings to government, business, and community leaders, as well as to the general public. This webinar today is part of our communication effort. And in addition, we write op-eds, policy briefs, and press releases describing recent research, and our faculty affiliates do media interviews on an attempt to get the message out there. We also host information sessions on policy topics for government leaders at the State House in Indianapolis. We just concluded our last of those and did 6 of them during the session in Indianapolis this year. The Research Center in Economics was founded on a belief that incentives matter and that government interventions often have unintended consequences. What really unites us as a group of scholars is the belief in the power of data analysis. We're not a think tank with a policy agenda. We do not speak with one voice. Instead, each researcher follows the data towards whatever conclusions are supported by the data. Our speaker today is Professor Fareed Farokhi. He joined Purdue after earning his PhD in 2015 from Penn State. His research combines detailed microdata with a structural estimation model that embeds micro-level behavior in a general equilibrium framework. There's applications, primarily to international trade and migration policy in his work. And although Fareed has produced a very broad research portfolio, his recent work is very focused on how trade policy interacts with agriculture and with the environment. This is an important research area and probably an understudied research area. There's just far more important government policies than there are researchers studying these policies. And in this economic policy webinar, Fareed is going to present on how trade policy can help reduce carbon emissions. After Fareed's presentation, we'll have a question and answer session, and I encourage you to type in your questions into the chat, and I'll moderate that question and answer session at the end. So, Fareed, the time is yours.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for having me here and for participating in this talk. And thanks for the generous introduction that also saves me to introduce myself. So yeah, as Kevin said, I'm today going to talk about the roles that international trade policy can have in order to curb global carbon emissions. Let me start by sketching the big picture as I understand. So basically, we tend to think that environmental damage is an externality, is the textbook example of externalities. What are externalities? That means that in the absence of regulations, in the absence of policy interventions, our activities may create a social harm while the market does not put a price tag on the harm we create. And so carbon emissions is such an externality, which is going to create and has already created very challenging problems ahead of the world economy. Let me clarify a few points. Sometimes these are very basic, and I believe everybody in the room knows better than me about it. But let me just clarify a few points. Sometimes in the media, when I read news, I tend to think that there is some confusion or fuzziness about them. So the first is that greenhouse gas emissions contribute to global warming. That in turn contributes to climate damage. And this is a different thing than local pollution. So here, I'm not going to talk about clean air or clean water. They are important, but that is a different thing. So yeah, so we are talking about greenhouse gas emissions that generate a global externality. And whenever you hear about like CO2 emissions or carbon emissions, the shorthand way of just referring to this phenomenon. And the second thing is that we are talking about the stock of CO2 in the atmosphere, not the annual flow per se. So the stock is the accumulation of flows from centuries ago until the present day. And this is why a delay in action can be, in fact, very costly. So even if we cut emissions by half everywhere today, the stock will grow. It will only grow at a slower rate. And so again, the global warming is something that we talk, and its relation to carbon emissions is related to the stock of carbon in atmosphere. The third is that some people talk about, some news media outlets talk about carbon taxes as if this is a price, a waste of money that we are paying, and ultimately we are throwing it to the ocean. This is a wrong perception, because carbon taxes, like any other taxes on production or consumption, will be collected by the government and in one way or the other will be redistributed back to the economy. Okay, I wanted to clarify these 3 points before moving ahead. So I'm going to talk about the roles of international trade policy in curbing carbon emissions. But let me emphasize that, like any other global complicated issue with multiple aspects, at the end of the day, there is going to be no single solution in all likelihood. There is going to be a package of policies, as usual, in all sorts of problems of this scale. Domestic politics of countries is going to be involved, economic and political institutions, also regulatory institutions, either at the level of nations or at the international level, are important to be taken into account. But however, I'm today focusing on one aspect of the problem, and it's the way that trade can play a role. So let me give you some basic numbers as to sketch the big picture a bit better. These are the data on carbon emissions across countries and industries. So if you look at recent years for annual carbon emissions, China is the highest emitter of carbons to the atmosphere, accounting for around 27% of that globally, followed by US, accounting for 15%, the EU that accounts for 10%, and India 7%, Russia 5%, and other countries less than that. However, you may argue that it's about the cumulative carbon emissions, and in that case, the highest is in fact the US by 25%, and EU by around 22%. Also, you may look at these numbers on a per capita basis, and in that case, US is ahead of China and many other countries by a notable margin. So it's not about just the cut of countries, but also the cut of industries, and there are all sorts of ways of classification of all economic activities into different industries. And so if you look at like some standard classification, then the electricity industry, these are power plants all around the world, account for 32% of global emissions. That is followed by agriculture, having a share of around 20%. Then transportation, mining, meaning like energy extraction, and non-metallic minerals like cement and such, around for 10%. So on a conceptual level, also being careful about having many countries and industries is important, because if we target carbon emissions of only one industry or just a subset of industries, that may not solve the problem on its own, because carbon use can move to other industries that are not targeted or that are less targeted. Or if we target carbon emissions in one country or only a small subset of countries, that again may not solve the problem for a similar reason, because carbon use can move to other countries that are with less strong regulations on carbon use. So for example, if it is only the US that puts a tax on coal, that is sort of like the most important form of energy for carbon emissions, US may demand less coal. And so in international markets, because US is a big player, coal price in all likelihood may fall. But then in that case, other countries can buy more coals. And the result from the global standpoint may look about the same. So it's important to take into account that there are many countries and industries, and they are interconnected in the global economy. And Kevin, in his generous introduction of me, mentioned that much of my work has been general equilibrium analysis. So that approach, general equilibrium analysis, is designed exactly in order to take into account that there are all sorts of interconnectedness between countries and industries at the level of the globe. All right, so let me go back to the nature of the problem, that was the externality, and explain that a little bit more before I explain what specifically I have done in my research. So think about a typical American household who owns a house. Then this household pays, I think it's very typical, that pays the homeowner's insurance. And if you think about it, there is some positive probability of maybe a fire, flood, or some form of damage to your house in the future. It is not certain that happens. It's uncertain. It has a probability which is positive, although it may be a low probability, but it justifies for you to pay the insurance. And so you may say that the probability might be only, I don't know, maybe it's just 5%, but if the damage occurs, for God's sake, that is your house, and that's why you paid. And now suppose all of us on Earth were only one big household. So in that case, the Earth would be our home, and very much like my example of homeowners insurance, we would pay the insurance against the potential future damage to the climate. That is effectively the logic of carbon pricing. And again, whether or not the damage will be a complete disaster is uncertain, but its probability is notable. And this is sort of, again, the logic, the reasoning behind carbon pricing. And you may think about it like paying for an insurance against the future potential damage to the climate. However, we collectively are basically doing very little about it. The question is why? So, okay, from my example, I think it's clear that because we are not one household, and this is very key. So you may think about households in my example as the government of countries. There are more than 150 countries in the world, and they are facing a global public good, which we call climate. And the harm that any country generates from 1 ton of CO2 emission is a negative externality, not only for the residents of that country, but also for everybody in the world. So at the level of nations, this means that the tax on carbon set by governments who act only on their self-interest is going to be likely way less than the tax on carbon that can correct for the harm generated for all households all over the world. Okay, so that means that what is optimal from one nation's standpoint corrects only for the harm of carbon emissions that that country generates for its own citizens, but the externality is occurring for all people in the world. And so this creates a well-known problem, which economists typically call the free riding problem. In this example, it means that every country may rely on carbon emission reductions of other countries while not undertaking proportionate abatement measures themselves. So then, just acknowledging this problem, it becomes important as how we can overcome the free riding problem that is impeding international climate agreements to be as effective as they can be. So if you think about it, this goes back to the nature that the nature of the externality that is global. And so because the externality is global, solutions to it also naturally may call for an international dimension. And among other reasons, this is one important one, why international trade comes into the picture, and why as a trade economist, I started to think about this problem. So there has been different policy proposals trying to combine carbon pricing with international trade policy. Among those, particularly two of them have got a lot of traction among policymakers as well as experts in this area. And again, so both of these proposals acknowledge that we want to overcome this free riding problem in international trade agreements. And to do so, we need to combine carbon pricing with notions or practices of trade policy. So I'm going to call these proposals Proposal 1 and Proposal 2. I'll explain them. Then I'll talk about how we have thought about them and how I have dealt with them in my research. So Proposal 1 is based on the following, that climate conscious governments, maybe like the EU, maybe if it is the US, then the US or any other country, climate conscious governments can use carbon border taxes in their tariffs. They can include these border taxes on the carbon content of imported goods included in their tariffs in order to influence carbon emissions in the rest of the world. So again, this is going to be a tax on imported goods whose carbon content is not appropriately taxed in other countries. And so this is not just a theoretical proposal. This has been a key component in the European Green Deal. And it seems to me, according to my understanding, that also it is a part of the Biden's plan in the package of policies that is targeting and discussing about climate change. So that is Proposal 1, but Proposal 2 has a different perspective in how we should combine trade policy with carbon objectives. So in that, climate conscious governments can form what we call a climate club, and then they want to use tariffs as a penalty device, as a punishment device, in order to incentivize other countries to join so that the club can be formed and expand. And so among experts who have developed the ideas around climate club and also popularized the idea is Nothaus, and he has written for the public as well as also in the domain of academics. And he's an important figure in this area. He also won the Nobel Prize for his work in economic growth and climate in 2018. All right, so the goal of my recent research has been to evaluate these two policy proposals. Before explaining what we have done, let me explain a bit about the past research on this area. These are important questions. So there has been some amount of educational work on this. So they have evaluated these proposals. And as I say, it's just very interesting and we've learned a lot from them. But they seem to us that they have two important limitations. So if you think about it and go back to my sort of the way I was trying to explain those proposals, there are tax rates. In Proposal 1, there are these border tax on carbon. Proposal 2, there are these tariff penalties in a sense. And so the first challenge we face here is that, all right, I understand the parameters of these policy proposals, but what should be the right rate of carbon border tax in Proposal 1 or the right rate of penalty tariffs in Proposal 2? So this, I mean, you can choose them arbitrarily, but then with those arbitrarily chosen rates, you cannot tell us or you cannot explain the full potential of these policy proposals. So there has been some work showing us how we should think about the optimal rates of these taxes. So they bring a notion of optimality when you want to choose these taxes. But that type of work has remained largely theoretical. It gives very good intuition for which channels of effect and how can be important, but not in a way that can be taken to data of many countries and industries. But the practical aspects of these policy proposals, of course, call for a quantitative approach. If there is one thing I've learned about talking to or trying to be connected to the policy work is that at the end of the day, you can explain all things, but then policymakers ask for concrete numbers. And so you want to have some quantitative aspect in your research. And so there has been some other work evaluating these proposals in quantitative manners, but what they miss is that they don't have a notion of optimality of those taxes. So they choose them in arbitrary ways. Also, they make all sorts of simplifications about the structure of the global economy, which might be consequential or not. But then my research is a step forward in that we wanted to have, and this is with a co-author, so we wanted to have an optimal rate of these taxes, either in proposal 1 or proposal 2, but also in a way that can be taken to data for quantitative analysis of these policies so that we could take advantage of abundance of data on production of industries, international trade, carbon intensities in many countries, as well as in many industries. All right, so recall policy proposal 1. And so consider, in order to sort of get at the full potential of that, consider a world in which every country is going to set a carbon border tax against other countries in all industries. The US does that, China does that, India does that, and so on and so forth. And so the question is, what would be the effect on, what would be the attainable reduction of reduction in global carbon emissions? So what we find is that the outcome of this policy does very little in reducing global carbon emissions. And if I want to put a number on that, that is only around 3% of emission reductions that could be attainable under the globally first best. What was the globally first best? If you think about it, it's just like as if one household is deciding and it's just correcting for the externality for everybody in the world when there is 1 ton of CO2 generated. And so what we find is that the outcome of this policy, when adopted by all governments, generated 3% of emission reductions attainable under that globally first best. So there are a number of reasons, but let me highlight one important one, probably the most important one. And in order to have a sense of that, in fact, you don't need to have a very complicated, fancy model, because a very large part of carbon emissions are generated in low tradable industries. And these are industries whose output rarely crosses international borders. For example, 2/3 of global emissions are generated by industries with a trade to GDP ratio as a measure of how much of your production crosses the borders. 2/3 of global emissions are generated by industries with a trade to GDP ratio that is less than 10%. And this includes power plants, the electricity industry, as well as agriculture, and a number of other industries. And if you think about those industries that are highly tradable, much of it is manufacturing, which as a whole only accounts for 20% of global emissions. So let me also make an example. It also matters that not every country is caring about the potential damage of climate damage as of today in an equal way. So India is a big country. It might be that climate damage to India might be much larger than to the US, but there are priorities in every country for all sorts of different reasons. And so the EU care or the US care toward climate damage is, as of now, a reality of the world, just larger than that of India. So then you may think, with its border carbon taxes, what can the EU, what can the US do about India importing coal from Australia, or China importing crude oil from the Middle East? We find that the carbon border taxes cannot be very effective, and is not a notable, it cannot be notably effective in reducing global carbon emissions. How about policy proposal 2, which I call the climate club proposal? This is a different approach in how we should combine carbon pricing with trade policy. So let me explain a bit clearly how it works, think about any club that you might be a member of. So if you're a member, then you must pay some membership fee, and then you can benefit from whatever the club is offering. And also you should act according to the rules of the club. So this is going to be a game in the sense that economists define game in game theory. And the way it works is that we want to have one country, maybe the EU, or a few countries, to be the core members, and a core member commits to the rules of the club, and other countries will play strategically. They will decide whether it is in their self-interest to join the club or not. And so the question is, what are the rules of the club? So if you are either a core member, so that you must commit to the rules, or you decide to join the club, then you must adopt a carbon pricing that corrects for the global externality you generate by your carbon emissions. So this means higher carbon border taxes, and that creates some loss of GDP for you potentially. And also you must impose trade penalties on whoever does not join the club, even if they retaliate against you. So this is sort of the rules of membership. You increase your carbon pricing, carbon taxes to globally optimum that corrects for the externality you create for everybody in the world. And also you impose trade penalties on those countries who stay out of the club. Okay, so if you stay out of the club, you can stick with your lower carbon taxes. And if there is any benefit in that in terms of production, then you can enjoy that. But then you incur the loss generated for you because there are these trade penalties imposed by you, by the members. However, if they choose these trade penalties against you, you can retaliate. So this is sort of the structure of the game, which I found very interesting. And so the question is, what would be the outcome of this climate club game? Before getting there, let me explain the trade-off that a country faces when evaluating whether or not to join the club. So the trade-off is as follows. There's going to be a loss incurred. If you join, there's going to be a loss incurred by adopting a higher carbon border taxes, but then you can escape trade penalties set by members. Okay, what we find is that the club of all nations is one equilibrium of this game, meaning that if the club of all nations is formed, then it's going to be sustainable. And so no country will find in its self-interest to deviate from that global coalition. So what is the club of all nations? This is the outcome that I call the globally first best, the outcome as if there is one household that is paying for its homeowner's insurance. However, and this is very important, like any other game, the climate club game may have multiple outcomes, multiple equilibria. So the important question that we face is whether the club of all nations is the only outcome of this game. So if you read about like which regions have been sort of initiating in practice more and more carbon taxing or carbon pricing, the EU is in the top of the list. So we start by supposing that the EU is the only core member, and then other countries will decide whether or not to join. With this, we find that the club of only EU is also an equilibrium outcome. So this means that if the EU is the only core member, then that alone is going to be also an outcome of the game, in that no country finds in its interest to join the EU. So one reason for that is that because EU alone does not have sufficient market power to incentivize other countries with its trade penalties to join the club. All right, so with the EU as the core member, we cannot rule out the non-cooperative outcome. So next we consider both the EU and the US as core members. So now your initial coalition or the core members includes, in addition to EU, also the US. With this, we find that all countries find in their self-interest to join the club. And so the club of all nations will become the unique, the only equilibrium, the only outcome of this game. And the way we solve this game is very interesting, as it gives us sort of an idea into a potential path of expansion of the club. So countries like Canada, Mexico, Turkey, who are close to either EU or US in terms of trade relationships, join the club no matter what other countries are doing. Then conditional on these countries joining the club, there's going to be some other countries that join, then conditional on that, some other countries will join, and so forth and so forth. And in the last rounds of joining, China, Indonesia, and Brazil join. And so as a result, the club of all nations will be the only equilibrium of this climate club game, but provided that both the EU and the US are core members. And so it is important that US is a big economy, and it has a lot of market power in a national relationships by using its according to trade flows that it has with other countries. Also, it is important that US is not that close to EU geographically. So if you look at the trade flows between the world, what we call the gravity equation of trade, distance between countries matters. And so you want the core members not only to be big economies, but also geographically scattered, so that they can exercise market power in this to establish the club and expand it. And again, the goal of the climate club game is not to initiate a trade war between countries, but it's sort of preemptive in the sense that it wants to use these trade penalties to enforce a coalition that is a happy outcome. Okay, so let me give the summary before I finish. So two takeaways I hope I could deliver is that first, border carbon taxes are not an effective tool at reducing carbon emissions. However, the climate club model can be remarkably successful, but its success hinges on the US taking an active role in joining the EU in order to establish the initial coalition of the club. With that, let me conclude and pass it to Kevin.
Great, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Let me start just by making sure that I've understood, just a clarification. So essentially, you're analyzing how trade tariffs could be used as a punishment for any country that is emitting too much carbon, or maybe another way to say it then is countries that aren't willing to join the club, you punish them with these tariffs, and they either can decide to stay out of the club and just pay the higher tariffs, or they could decide to join, which would mean they would have to have lower emissions. Is that the basic idea?
That is the basic idea. Also, what is interesting about this is that they can retaliate. And when you want to join the club as a small country, if you think that, for example, China is not going to join, but once you are in the club, you're going to impose your tariff penalties against China, you take it into account that China may also retaliate against you. Yeah. But then there is also those core members and other members. So you put all of this into your analysis.
Okay, that's great. Well, let's start off with some of the questions. Michael asks about why it is that greenhouse gas policies have not been effective so far. So he says the Montreal Protocol was globally effective at protecting the ozone layer. Why was that so successful, and why is there so much resistance to coordinated global greenhouse gas emissions policies? Why haven't they worked so far? Why do we didn't need a trade tariff penalty to make the ozone layer safe? Why is greenhouse gas emissions different?
Yeah, that's a great question. My understanding is that, and maybe we do not know the answer beforehand, but as it happens, we will know exposed. But it's just in the case of the ozone thing, it was the case that they found quickly how to deal with it in terms of substituting the gas that was creating the damage with other technologies. And so if you think about it, about carbon emissions, the scale of the problem seems to be much larger in terms of like whether we can find substitutes for the forms of fossil fuels in like a short amount of time, that doesn't seem to be a likely scenario, at least in the short run. But, and I also tried to mention in the beginning that using trade policy is not the only way to think about it. At the end of the day, it's going to be a package of policies. And one important other dimension here is also thinking about technologies that could replace our sort of dependence on fossil fuels. And yeah, so that is also another possibility to think about. But we are talking about very uncertain future. And I don't have any intelligent comment to put on that. But that is also a possibility. You never know whether that may happen or not. But if it happens, it is going to be in 10 years or a century.
Yeah, well, and it's not as if fossil fuels are the only source of carbon emissions to begin with. I mean, there's all sorts of other sources that have nothing to do with energy. Cement, for example, agriculture. Just there's all sorts of emission sources. So it seems that we're not going to have one single technology that's going to solve all these issues, most likely.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what you said, that just the scale of the problem and how complicated and sort of versatile it is also is not comparable to the ozone problem.
Okay. Well, one thing you mentioned at the end, though, was about the uncertain future. And you mentioned Nordhaus's work. Michael asked about what do you do about discounting as you're coming up with the appropriate global carbon price? I mean, this requires balancing costs and benefits across generations. What's the optimal price when you're thinking about what the penalty should be or what the border adjustment tax should be? How do you come up with that?
Oh, that's a great question. Again, so there has been enormous amount of work about getting the social cost of carbon right. And in that, as you said, it's just that there is this discount rate that matters a lot. So what we do is that we say this is beyond the scope of our work. So we are going to take the social cost of carbon, and then given that, so the global first best tax on carbon would be whatever targets that. Mm-hmm. And so we take that as given, we solve our game, but then we do that with other scenarios of social cost of carbon. And so we do it with like maybe a low, maybe a medium or a high scenario. And across all of those, what I was trying to say would hold.
How would you do this in practice? I mean, it feels like in practice, starting the club and picking the tax rates, it feels like you need to have everybody agree on what social cost of carbon are we going to target. And I understand that you're saying you're not the environmental policy expert who's going to give the answer, but really this is about coordinating countries to all want to agree to some course of action. How do you think you get them to agree to join the club and to pick a particular social cost of carbon to target?
So if you think about it, what is the true social cost of carbon differs from how governments are taking action to perceive the social cost of carbon. And it's not just the discount rate, or maybe we can call it the effective discount rate. So going back to the example of India, for example, if you look at the available estimates, the damage to India is among the largest. The damage to African countries is among the largest. But in fact, Canada will benefit from, according to available estimates, will benefit from that. But meanwhile, you see that the Canadian government is taking actions. The Supreme Court is just taking the action for carbon pricing, while we do not expect the Indian government or African governments to do anything meaningful, maybe in this decade. So at the end of the day, it might be required to have some transfer schemes or some form of compensation for countries who have other priorities. This is my understanding, because it will be very hard to convince a poor country to put carbon taxes while they have a lot of population that is below the poverty line.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, so coming at this from that sense of justice, I mean, is it right for the United States and the EU to sort of form this climate club and to say, nope, everybody else that doesn't join our club, we're going to put huge carbon taxes. You know, we're going to put trade tariffs on you. We're going to exclude you from this economic engine of growth. I'm just wondering, is that a just way of going about this? Or alternatively, should we just allow businesses, which have been making some progress recently, lots of multinational corporations have been trying to reduce carbon emissions from their global supply chain. Should we just allow businesses to just do this on their own? What do you think?
So I can say what I think as a citizen and also as a researcher.
Okay.
So as a researcher, I think that I want to do that you suggested, but one thing at a time. So because the problem is just so complicated, and you have to look at, like, maybe in one research project, you have to look at one aspect of the problem, then maybe the technology aspect. So for example, you were mentioning that if there are companies and businesses who may find ways to reduce carbon emissions with little cost damage to their production, or they find sort of the right technologies to go along, then also the technology could be a positive externality for other countries who are not taking those investments. So these are very important problems. But again, as a researcher, I had to just go about and thinking about these problems one at a time. But I acknowledge that. As a citizen, I totally agree with you that what is just also should be part of that. And if it is not just, it is very hard to convince other countries to join. And about the climate justice, it's also not, as I said, the annual flow, but the accumulated carbon that every country has generated. That is also seems to be part of the discussion.
Okay, that's a good point. So you're saying it's not just about carbon being emitted today, but maybe the club rules will have something to do with how much carbon has been emitted in the past. And so there'd be a higher cost in some sense on the United States and the European Union. Well, Fareed, this was a wonderful discussion. Thanks so much for being willing to answer these questions and presenting this really innovative way of working to try to get global agreement on greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, I think most people sort of feel that we haven't gotten anywhere over the past few decades, and that, you know, countries are just unwilling to get along and when it comes to this particular issue. And what you're suggesting is a potential mechanism to overcome that, which is really exciting.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to hear that.
Well, thanks to all the attendees for coming to this PURCE Economic Policy webinar. I hope you enjoyed this opportunity to learn more about this really important environmental policy issue. And like you, I care a lot about government policy. And I always look forward to having opportunities to interact with scholars who are using data to estimate how government policies affect our lives. So this is the last of our econ policy webinars for this semester. We're going to be coming back again in the fall, and we're planning to do next falls both in person and online. That is, we'll start up the tradition of doing lunch before the talk and having the presentation and questions in person, but also broadcasting it. At least that's our hope, but we'll see if that all goes ahead like we hope with university policies in the fall. I also encourage you and invite you to learn more about the research that our scholars are producing. You can do that at our website. Also, I invite you to donate to support our current initiatives in providing educational opportunities for undergraduate students, and also these information sessions and other ways that we're trying to reach out to get economic policy research in the hands of the public and government leaders. Thanks so much for attending this economic policy webinar. And this is now going to conclude our broadcast.
Thank you.